Welcome back, guys, to another video. This is Junior here. I teach everything related to backend development, making backend development way too easy to understand. If that is you and you're interested in learning more about backend development, consider subscribing and turn on that notification bell because I'll be dropping bangers each and every time with content related to backend development and sometimes front-end development, right? So today we're going to be starting off with the new complete series on Node.js security. So like, share, subscribe, turn on that notification bell so that you can be notified whenever I'm dropping, right? So on this Node.js security crash course, we're going to be looking into the following stuff. The first part, which is this video, we're going to be looking into authentication. The second part, we're going to be looking into session management with all the subtopics. The third part, we're going to be looking into NoSQL injections. The fourth, we'll be handling untrusted data. The fifth part will be handling access control. The sixth part, we are going to be looking at XSS attacks, the notorious XSS attacks. And number seven, lastly, we're going to be looking into connection security. So today on this video, that is authentication, what are we going to be doing? We're going to be looking on application level validation, database validation, password storing, and mitigating brute force attacks that we can get. Right. So before we get started, pause that video, like, comment, subscribe, turn on that notification bell. Let's get started. So with regards to this project, I already have a base project that I've already set up. So I have a pre-assumed idea that the people watching this video have a basic understanding of Node and JavaScript. However, you don't have to be an expert, just that basic level of understanding is required, right? And with that basic level, this is a beginner-friendly crash course. So do not worry, I'll be explaining each and every line of code that I'll be doing all the time, right? So here we just have a basic server whereby we have a Mongodb connection, we have our server instance, we have our body parser, we are connecting to MongoDB, and we're starting our server here, right? And then all these other things, we have our file structure for our controller, whereby we have our auth controller, our models, our routes, and our utils, currently empty, but then we'll make use of, right? So now if I were to start this project, we'd see that the only thing that we have right now is we just have just a basic server that is starting, right? So now let's go back here. So now we want to handle authentications. Obviously, we need a model whereby, for in this case, we'll just have email and password. We don't want any other fields because we just want to focus on how to handle this things, which is your passwords, handling them properly, storing your passwords, so on and so forth. Right. So now here with regards to this, we're going to first look into the application level of validating whatever information we get, right? So now you realize that when we're dealing with our email and passwords, we're dealing with sensitive information, right? Which is our authentication information for the user, right? So there are a few things that we need to make sure that they are actually valid, right? So first things first, when we're dealing with a user's password, we don't want to have the user's password stored as raw as we get it, right? So that's the first thing. So on each and every part, we'll be adding a layer of security, right? Or enforcing a layer of security so that if we have a database leak, for some odd reason, we have a database leak, the user's passwords, they're not compromised, right? So we will start with that, whereby we start with the application level of validating everything, and before we even store this data into the database, right? So now we'll create our controller. We say export class, and we say auth controller, right? So now in order for us to be able to hash the password, we need a module that we have to make use of, which is called the bcrypt, right? So I'll come in here, say npm I bcrypt, just like that. So now this module will help me so that whenever before I save data in the database, I can first hash the data, right? So now how then do we make use of this data? So I'll come in here, we import this bcrypt module, and then I'll come say from, and then we say bcrypt, right? And then with that said, we need to import certain functions, which is gensalt, which is hash, and compare, right? So now we create our sign up method. We say request response, right? So now since we're using body parser, a body parser will pass our request body so that we get the information that we need. So we can come here, destructure that request body whereby we expect email and password only, right? So I'll come say request dot body, right? So now the first things first is I obviously want to make sure that this information that I get is not null, right? So I come in here and then return a response. We return a response dot status of 400 dot JSON, and we say all fields are required, right? So now that is the first thing that we check, that all fields that we get, which is email and password, they are not null. So now the second thing is what we do. What do we do now? We want to start with the process of hashing this password, because we don't want to store an unhashed password, because if we get something like password, we want to get an equivalent of something like this, which makes it a bit harder to crack, you know. So that's the first thing. So now what then we do is we need salt that is coming from bcrypt. So we say await, and bcrypt is asynchronous, so that's why we need this await, and then we give it the number of rounds, right? So this is the cost of processing, which regards to the how it would hash this thing. So that by default bcrypt uses 10 rounds, and then I'll just give it 18, I mean. So now, due to us having used await here, we now have to use async, right? And then now that we have generated the salt, we now have to hash the password. We now say hashed password, and then we say is equal to await, and then we use the hash function, and then we say password. The first argument is what you want to hash, and then the second argument is the rounds that you want to use. So if we console.log this, we will see that we have now hashed the password. Let's say hashed password, and then we print out that hashed password. You now will see the difference as to what we get. So now let's expose this route, and then we get started. So now import from express. From express, what then do we want? We want a router, and we also want to import the controller, right? And then we say like that, we go to the controller, we go to auth.controller, and then we import that. Come on. And then we get that. So now we instantiate our route router, and then we create a new instance of the controller. We say controller is equals to new auth controller, just like that. And then now this would be a post request because we want to sign up. We say API/sign up, and then this will be request response, and then we say controller.sign up. We pass in that the request and the response, and then we need to expose this router. We say export default router, right? And then now that we've created this router, we want to expose this router to our server, and then that's where I can now come in here just to remove these two semicolons, and then I can come say import, and then from go one up from route, we want to import auth.route, and we say auth route, and then that's where now I can come in here and say server.use. I want to use auth route, right? So now let's just try and send this, and let's see if we get anything that the hashed password that we want. So we go to sign up. I can use this one, and then go to the body, and then JSON body. If it wants to open, there we go. So I'll use the same email, which is junior@gmail.com, and the password called junior, right? So now if I send this, my server is not up. So let's start our server, npm run dev. So obviously we won't get any response as yet. We just console logging out so that we see that we actually getting that hashed password. So if I send that, I expect to see my hashed password in a few seconds if this thing wants to work. So let's see. Why did I control C? I'm sorry for that. So then our auth controller, and let's get it. So let's go to our Thunder client, and then we send that request. Go there, and then why are we not getting any logs? So let's see, maybe it's just still processing. Let's just hope for the best. So let's just also add a response so that we know that it has paused, if you understand what I mean. So I can return a response dot status of 200 for now, JSON, and then say done, right? And then I didn't even need that. As you can see, it took time to hash and everything. So this was the password that I gave, as raw as it is. If we come in here, we gave junior as the password, and that was converted back to this, right? So now this is somewhat of a level of security that we're adding, right? So that database leak, users' passwords are not compromised, right? However, as much as we're doing that, right, we need to enforce certain validations within the application level. What then do I mean by this? Because as much as that password is hashed to that, you realize that if a user could have guessed, say for example, I had a password like this, right? If I were to sign in, as much as this thing is hashed like that, right? It's still easy for a user to guess this password, because this is equivalent to that in the eyes of Bcrypt when we are now to sign in this user. So now, how then are we to now enforce another layer, right, into this application? So what we want to do next is we want to tell this application, we want to use something called Express Validator. So now we want to enforce authentication. We want to authenticate the body first, right? Not authenticate, we want to validate the request body first. And what do I mean by validating the request body first? Is we want to make sure that the data that we get, right, from the request body, say for example, with regards to password, right, we shouldn't get a password that is maybe less than 10. That's number one. Number two, we shouldn't get a password that is not alphanumeric, because if it's like this, it's easy to its strength is very, very weak. The password strength is very, very weak. So we now also want to add something called, and the password should be alphanumeric. That's the second thing. The third thing, we also want to make sure that this password will also have somewhat of special characters, so that it has maybe special characters like that. So this is a kind of valid password we expect to get. Before we even send anything or process anything, we validate the body of this request, right? So now this way, now we'll use a package called Express Validator, which should be our middleware. So we say npmi, and then we say express dash validator, right? So now once we do that, we can now close this for a while, and then we come here. So we're not yet done. So we come in here to our source, and then we create a folder called middlewares, right? So this Express Validator would be our middleware. So now we'll say auth body validator dot middleware dot js, right? So now how then do we use this thing, right? So we now have to import it. Say import, and then we say from Express Validator, right? And then from there, what then do we do? We want to import check and validator, not validator, but then validation results, right? And then here I will then create a function, right? We say export const, and then we say validate, we say auth body validator, right? So now we'll say to this thing, and that should be like that. So this would be in that format. And then the first things first that we do is we'll use this check, and this check will take in a field, right, as an argument. What is this field? If we go to Thunder client, right, just to show you guys, within our JSON, we have key value pairs, right? So the field that we're accessing is this key, which is email and password. So these are the ones that we want to validate. So this is where I can now first say here, email, right? And then now with that said, I can now enforce certain rules to validate this email. So first things first, we'll trim it, whereby we're removing all white spaces. And then the second thing is Express Validator has a check to check if is an email, right? And then the second thing, we don't want this field to be empty. That's why we enforce a not empty. And then the second thing, when this thing, right, is empty, then we can enforce an error message, and this error message, I can now say email is not to be empty, right? And then now I can chain in more checks. But then once this error message has been sent out, what Express Validator has for me is bail. What does bail mean? Is I don't have to check other things because I've now reached one error. So let me just stop here with regards to this email field. That's what the bail function does. So but then now if it passes that, I believe with regards to email, this is basically everything that we need. And I can also add here a message here for if it's not a email, and then we can say enter a valid email, and then we can enforce that bail that if this was not a valid email, let's not even check if it's empty or what, because it's not a valid email. We've now validated that, so there's no need to check this thing that is not empty, because it won't be empty if we've checked this, right? So now the next thing that we want to do is we separate all this by comma. As you can see, we're running an array here, right? So we separate by a comma. So now here we add in the second check. Remember, this is a middleware that we're running. The middleware is a bit weird, but then this is how, even from the documentation, it has to be written with regards to Express Validator. So now the second thing that we want to check is we want to check the password field, right? So now with the password field, we can still do somewhat of the similar things. We trim out all white spaces, first things first. And then secondly, we can check if it's not empty, right? And then if it is, we got an error, an empty field, and then we can say password is required to create account, right? So now we can even bail so that we don't even check any other things, right? And then if this check is passed, that means that the field is not empty, right? So now what then do we want to check? So this is where we enforce certain rules, right? With regards to this, we say matches, right? So we now want to give it a regex so that it doesn't accept something like this. It will only accept something like that there should be special characters and a number, at least one or more, right? So this is where we now enforce a regex rule. So now within this regex rule, what then do I do here? Right, so we come in here and then we give it the first part, whereby with regards to our first part, what are we then to say, right? Now we are to tell this thing that at least you should have, right? We tell this, and then we give it a small letter to A to Z of small letter and a capital letter, right? And then we say at least there should be one or more. And then the next thing, we come in here, we do somewhat of the same thing, equal, dot, and then star. And then what then we do is we say that we can also accept numbers 0 to 1, and you can have one or more. And then finally, we come in here, we do the same thing, and then we say to this thing we can accept also special characters such as exclamation, hashtag, dollar, percentage, and a star, right? So these are the special characters that we're accepting, and you can have one or more, right? And then we end like that. So now when we get a password, our Express Validator will check if this password actually matches this regex that we have, right? And then if it doesn't match, we give it a with message and we say password must be alpha numeric plus containing at least one or more special characters. Right. So we expect the front end to be showing these characters that, because obviously when you're working with as a developer, right, you're working with a front end developer. So we expect the front end developer to show the acceptable special characters, right? So we can just send this error message back. So now if that is said, we bail. Right, so we don't want to continue checking this thing. And then finally, if this check is passed, we want to validate its length, right? And we say dot is length, and then we give it a minimum of 10, right? And then if that is not given to us, we give a with message, and we say password has to be at least 10 characters or more. Right. So now this is how we'd check the two fields. And then finally, what then we do, because remember, this thing is a middleware, right? So now the third and the final part, that's where we take in the request, response, and the next, right? And this is a function, right? And then here in this function, that's where we check if there is any error that has been sent back by this checks that we made. So that's where we say const errors, right, is equals to validation results, and then we pass in the request body, right? And then once we do that, we check if we get, if not errors dot is empty, right? What then do we do? It means that we know that we have errors here, right? And then we come in here. Why am I giving those kind of brackets? We come in here, and then we return a response.status, the status of 422.json. And what then we do is we send back the errors that we got, which is errors.array, right? Because those are all the errors that we get. We want to send back to the client. But then now, if this check has been passed, what then do? We now call upon the next function, because remember, this is a middleware. We want to take this user further to where they wanted to go to, right? So now this is basically our validation on the application level, right? So let's run this middleware directly now, and then we see if we are actually validating this fields, right? And then if this thing doesn't work, it's our job as developers to debug, right? And then we come to middleware's auth body validator, and then we grab that, and then we add that as a middleware. Don't forget that comma, right? So now with that, that should validate our request body before we even try and interact with this data. We don't even care about interacting with this data, but then we care about validating this thing, making sure that this thing is doing exactly as it should, so on and so forth, right? So now I can come in here, and then let's make sure our server is running. Right. So we're just gonna keep the request like this. We expect an error, right, coming from the password, because one, we don't have the appropriate length. Two, it's not meeting the regex specification, right? So those are the things that we don't expect this thing to even work. And there we go, right? So we get a 442 that we expected unprocessable entity. And the second thing, we get that password, that the password must be alphanumeric plus contain at least one or more of the special characters. Right. So let's give it a number and a letter, let's say #1. But then still we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So now we expect to get an error with regards to the length. As you can see, this thing is now telling us, okay, it sees that it is alphanumeric with a special character, but then the length is not 10. So there's a problem here, right? So basically, we can see that our checks are working, but let's give it something that it works. Let's say that, and then let's give that. And then obviously right now, I don't know what's happening with regards to, let's go to our controller. We should get a response of done, I guess. We should get a response of done, and that's what we expect, because our validations are passed, so on and so forth, and our hash should be made. So the hash takes a bit of time because it's a process, and then we do get that response of done. So our checks have been made. So, but let's also check if this email is validated, and you can see the email is validated as well, that enter a valid email, right? And it wouldn't accept an empty field. If I come in here, as you can see, I have that comma there, it's not processing that, so that's why I had that. And you can see enter a valid email, the email is not there, so it's telling us that. And we could have added, let's go to this, so why is it only giving that? If we had started with not empty, hence it's only checking an empty field can never be a valid email. Do you get it? Hence it's not showing the part that email is not empty. So I should have started with this. This would have made more sense. What do I mean? I cut that out. We check not empty and send that and bail out. And then thereafter add this email. Right. So now it should first check if the field is not empty. Thereafter check if the email is valid. So that's what I mean. So now if I send that, we get email is not to be empty. So that's what was happening there. We first check, so if I were to go through this one more time, is we check the field which is email, and then we trim it. And then the first thing we check not empty. And if this thing is empty, we return this with message and say email is not to be empty, and then we bail. And this bail says that do not check any other things, because at this point this thing is empty. Why check if is an email, right? But then if it's not, if the field is not empty, that's where we check is it a proper email. And if it's not a proper email, we say enter a valid email, and then we bail out. And then secondly, what then we check is the password, right? And then when we check the password, we first check if the password is not empty. So this was good by us. And then we say password is required to create account. And then if this thing was true that the password is empty, we bail. We don't even want to check if it matches the regex, because an empty string will never match a particular regex. And then within here, we now create a regex whereby we're saying that this password must have at least one of our alphabets, small letters or big letters, A to Z. And then we say we also expect at least one of our numbers from 0 to 9. And then we say we also at least expect one of these special characters, one or more. But then if we don't get any of these things, we return that password must be alphanumeric plus containing at least one special characters. And we expect the front end to show the special characters. And then we bail out, because we don't even have to check the length. And then secondly, even if a user gave an alphanumeric like we saw here, that I gave an alphanumeric, but then due to the length not being appropriate, what then happens, right? Let's also give a valid email. So what then happens is, even though this thing is alphanumeric with a special character, if it doesn't meet the length, which is 10, then what then do? We send that the password must have at least 10 characters. So now here we've enforced another layer. One, we are hashing our password. Before we even interact with the database, we hash the password. And even before we hash the password, we first validate that the data is exactly the structure that we want and require, right? So that is something that we are looking into, right? So now that we've revalidated the data that is coming to make sure that it is exactly what we want, we've hashed the password. What else is left of us? What is left of us is now to save to the database. But then before we save to the database, we also have to enforce certain things also into the database, right? We also want to have the database to validate things that we get. We don't want to just end it here on the application level. Also on the database level, we want to enforce certain rules, right? So now what then do we do, right? We come in here. We don't have to create a new file. I come here to my models, right? So here we have our user model, very basic, right? Very, very basic, right? And here, what then do you want to do? So I'm not really a fan of using regexes for emails, as much as you can use that, but then I don't believe that it's pinpoint. What then I believe is validating through maybe sending an email, so on and so forth, using other service providers to do that for you. But then what we'll do here is to enforce the same amount of rules with regards to the password here. So it should also still match the same regex. As much as we're doing it here, we should also enforce it on the database level. So I'll just copy that regex as it is and then dump it there. But then if you guys are also interested with regards to what's this email, adding a regex on your email, you can add a regex whereby you can say match and then you give it somewhat like that, and then we can say to this thing that, and we can say, so there are tons and tons of regexes with regards to email that would be true or false, and hence I'm not really that much of a huge fan with regards to this approach with regards to emails, right? So I can enforce this regex and then say to this thing 0 to 8, and you can have that, and then that could be at least one or more. And we also have the ending part of the email, right, which most likely is 3 because it's .com, .co.za, something like that. So we can enforce that, and then we have that regex working just fine with regards to our email. But then this doesn't, I'm really not a fan, like I've said. Right, so here we also now enforce a database validation, that also the data that is coming in on the data, validate this so that we get an error if it doesn't match. So now we have had tons, not tons and tons, we have three layers here. We have application layers validation, we have hashing, and we have database level validation, right? So now with that said here, we can now successfully save this user to our database. So now this way, now I come to my controller, right? And then without doing that, now I can now say new account is equal to await, not await, we don't need that, we say new user model, and then here we pass in the email and then the password, but then we change that to be hashed password, right? And then now I can now come save this user const saved account. I can now say const saved account, which is await, and then we say new account dot save, right? And then we give that. So I can now wrap this in the try catch so that if there is any error that arises, because remember there's validations there, so if there is any error that arises, we can now try catch, and then we return the response.status of 500, and then .json, we throw in the error. But then now if this user was successfully added, I can now return response.status of 201.json, and then I can add this and say account added or account created successfully, right? So now this should work appropriately. So now let's also add one more function, which is get users, so that we can be seeing our users. So I'll say get, let's say get users. So this will be just a helper function that will be used by us, and then this should be asynchronous. I won't really explain much on this one because it's not really much. We're just getting users with regards to our database, and say user model.find, we want to find all of them, and then we return response.status of 200.json, and then I throw in the data, and then here I just want to expose that route as well. Say router.get, and then we say API/users, and then we get in that request the response, and then we expose that controller dot get user request response, right? So now our server are like a clean terminal. Let's clean up that, and let's see if we can create an account, and then we get our users, and that should work just fine, right? So I come to my that junior@gmail.com. Obviously I send that, I should get that, right? Now let's create a password that we'll remember. So I'll say junior hashtag 1234, and the password is 1234567891011, right? So now that should pass our checks. So now let's send that request and let's see what happens, right? And then we should get a created account without no problems. But then you guys know with code anything can happen. So if there is a problem, You know, I always say that it's our job as developers to debug. You must learn to love your bugs, so that you can resolve them. Right. So now let's see what we get. So as you saw, that it does take a bit of time with regards to hashing the password. It takes a good chunk of time. So let's see this, and then we see that our account is created successfully. Now let's change this route to users, and then we have that get, and then we should get our data back. And you can see we have this data that we have, this large data, right? So now once we have that, obviously a user wants to sign in, right? So now this is where now signing in, there's tons and tons of, not tons and tons of things, but then there's few things that we have to consider, right? So you realize that there are users that can be trying to attack other people's accounts. So like trying iterating over passwords to see if that's the user's password, and that's what we call brute forcing. So when we handling login, we want to look into that mere fact that people can be trying to brute force to get people's password. So we have to mitigate that. That's one thing that we have to look into. But then first thing, we're gonna take everything in steps by step. So what then do I mean by this? So it's still the same thing that when we're signing in, right? And why did this thing close? So when we're signing in, let's create this sign in and say request response, right? So when a user is signing in, you realize that we're still getting this same fields, email and password, right? And then we can just do that. So we're still getting this fields. So this fields still have to be validated by this auth body. We always want to validate that, okay, why are you trying to sign in and the password is not alphanumeric? Because we won't accept that. We don't even have to entertain that, right? So that's one thing for sure, right? So now here, because this error messages were specifically talking about creating account, blah 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 blah. Password must be containing. So it's no need. There's no need. So yeah, I don't want to be creating the same one and the same thing. Yeah, we can just do this and then do that, but then still one and the same thing. I'll use one and the same validator, but then the namings and everything is still the same thing. So here we'll still validate that the email is given to us. It's not empty, and we'll still check the password that it adheres to the structure, because if it adheres to that structure, then this person potentially is an authentic, is a right person. So that's what we want to do. So yeah, for now, before we do anything, I'll return a response.status of 200.json, and then we say message, and then we say authenticated, right? So now let's expose that route. So I'll come in here, say router.post, and then /API /sign in, if that, and then request response, right? And then say controller.sign in, request response, right? So now here, what we expect to do is we now just, first of all, we want to first validate the data that is coming in, right? So before we do anything, so we now say sign in, we give a post, right? So now if a user gives us something like this, all right, within our sign in, why we get, oh yeah, so we're getting authenticated because we didn't add that middleware. As you can see, the middleware is not added. So now we have to authenticate, we say auth body validator, right? So we want that body to be validated. So now if I send this request, is my server, oh, my server still restarting. So let's just kill it and then restart that ourselves, right? So first thing, we want to validate information on the application level before we even interact with our database. If our application is not happy, then we don't even have to silo the person down to database. So once we get there, we know that if someone within our application sends us a password like this, and this person is trying to do something snacks, right? Something that is not there. So we can tell this person that the password must be alphanumeric, blah, 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 blah. Same time, we can kick this person out, right? And then also, if you're not giving a valid email, right, why do we have to continue with you? So those are the first things that we have to look into. But then if a user sends valid things, for now we're saying authenticated because we have not gone on deep with regards to what's happening. That's the first thing. So now the second thing, what then are we to do with regards to this application? right? So now that we have validated the data, right? Before we can even do anything, we first wanna handle brute forcing attacks, right? We first wanna handle that because we don't want people to be logging in or trying to log in 100 number of times, because that is them trying to brute force our system, right? So we want to keep track of each and every person that is trying to log in. So before we can even take this person to our authentication system, we first must check that this person, can they go through, can they authenticate, can they start login process? If yes, we give them permission. But then if this person cannot, then we stop that. So that is the first thing that we have to check, right? And then how then do we do that? So we'll have a login tracker schema model that we'll create, right? So now let's come in here and then say login tracker dot model dot JS. So within this model, that's where we'll be keeping track of each and every interaction with our login route from the client, so on and so forth, right? So now what then do we need here, right? Here we'll come here. Let's create this model or the schema model, and we say this is coming from Mongoose, and we say schema and model, right? So now with that said, we can say const login tracker schema is equal to new schema, and then within this new schema, we need a unique key to identify these users, right? So now I'll say key, and this key is a type of string, and it is required, right? And then the second thing that we need is we need to keep track of all the failed attempts that this user had, because say for example someone is trying to crack someone's password, right? So obviously they would have tried maybe n number of times, right? So that's what we want to keep track of, that this failed attempts, five, if a person fails to log in 3 times, obviously they'll now use the forget password. That is just logic, guys. So but then if someone tries more than 3 times, yeah, there is an exception, someone could say, but if they try maybe 10 times, that is absurd. And that is absurd. So we need to keep track of those things, of this failed attempts, right? So I'll now say failed underscore attempts, and this is a type of number, and by default it will be 0, right? And then we need to also that when this user, we have blacklisted this user, right? We need to give them a timeout, right? So that if they failed, we give them a timeout, right? So this timeout we'll keep track of, which will say timeout. And then we say that is a date, right? And whenever we say default of this thing is new date, right? So now that's when we give a timeout of a user that interact with our login system at least after maybe 2 minutes or a minute after failing so much times, right? So that's why this timeout would be for. And then now we also have to keep track of if someone is trying to log in right now. So attackers are or hackers are very clever, guys. So there's something called parallel HTTP requests. What is parallel HTTP request? What do I mean? This is parallel HTTP request. What is parallel HTTP request? Say for example, I'm sending in requests to the same client, and I send more than one. That is what we call parallel HTTP requests. So we need to also keep track that this user, if there is someone trying to interact with this key, right? This key login, this document, we need to now block other people trying to interact with the same key, right? So this is just making sure that only one request coming from this one person is being made. We don't want to have parallel requests, right? So what then do we do is we'll have an in underscore progress tracker, right? Which is a type of boolean, and by default that is false, right? So now this boolean will keep track of that. So now my computer is flattening, and let's just get this on charger, right? So if this cable wants to open anytime soon, right, let's put this on, and then we can continue with regards to our work. All right, so now that we've created the schema, what then we want to do is we want to create the relevant model, right? So now we come in here. Now my laptop is on charger. We say export const login tracker model is equals to new, not new, but then model. And then we say login tracker, and then we pass in the relevant schema, right? So I can move that, right? So now with that said, what then do we do next? Because we have this model, right? But then within this model, what we want to do is we want to create what we call static methods, right? And these static methods are the ones that will be helping us to check and interact with this model seamlessly, right? Because we don't want to now do everything outside this file. We just want to keep everything related to this login tracker directly within this file. So now what then we do is we say login tracker schema. So we use the schema, and then we create static methods. And the static methods, we have to give it a name, right? So the first one that we can use is we first have to check if this person can log in, right? So now we can create a method called can log in. Make sure that C is a proper C. And we create a method called can log in, right? So now this method will be asynchronous, and it uses the ES5. So make sure you use the ES5. I think when I used ES6 with regards to the Mongoose schemas and trying to add things, doesn't really work quite properly. But then if it does work properly with regards to Mongoose and using ES6, please comment down below so that I'd know and then look up into that as well. Right. So now what then do we do with regards to this? So we send in a key. So whenever we call in this can log in function, we'll send in a key. And this key will help us to identify this document of the user. Right. So what then do we do? We first come here, excuse me, and then we'll say log in is equals to await. We get this user's model. And then here we'll say use the this keyword. We say this dot find one. And we want to find one by key, whereby it's that key. Remember this key that we placed here, right? And then the next thing is, now that we found this user potentially, we want to check that. So if this user has a document with us, right? If not, I mean, if they don't have a document, plus, or maybe they have failed attempts that are less than 2. So I'll just keep it as 2 for now, but then obviously within your application, you can keep it more than 2. So this is just for demo purposes, right? I'll keep it that if a user fails more than 2 times, we'll temporarily block them, right? So now if this user doesn't have an account or a document with us, with this login document, or their failed attempts, they're less than 2 if they do have a document, what then do we do? We can return true, that this person can still try and log in, right? But then if this user has failed attempts that is equal to 2 or greater than, what then do we want to do, right? So first things first, we want to check their timeout. If their timeout has elapsed the minute, so we want to check the time that we have currently with the time set within their document, so that if the difference between now and that time is 1 minute plus, right? What then do we want to do? We now can let them access this login system, because they've now waited at least 2 minutes or at least a minute, right? Depending on your application and all that. So we can here come say timeout diff. So we say timeout difference, and then here we say new date, which is for the current date now, but then we want to get time. You want to get time, right? and that will get the time in milliseconds. And then we want to minus that by the new date. I'm passing in the login timeout. Remember, the login timeout is a actual date, right? And then we want to minus with that, but then we say get time of that, right? So all this will be given back to us in milliseconds, as you can see, because we're minusing um, milliseconds time, and with that. So now what do we do? We know that 1 minute is equivalent to 60, I think 60,000 or 60,000, I'm not sure. If I'm not mistaken, is it 60,000 or 6,000? I think it's 60,000, right? If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong. But then I think a minute is equivalent to 60,000, right? In milliseconds. Milliseconds. I think that is the case, but then I might be wrong. So here, once we have the time difference, right, we want to check if this timeout difference is greater than or equal to 60,000. What then do we do? I can now say await login.remove, right? It means this person can try and authenticate. So when a person tries to authenticate, we will now remove the document that they had with us and then return true, right? Because they might have a successful login. So when a person has a successful login, we don't want to keep that document in there, because this thing is not for keeping track of when a person logged in. No, 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 no. It's just keeping track of the amount of attempts which a user is trying to log in with us to avoid brute force attacks, right? So that is the aim of this whole login tracker. We not want to track if the user logged in 2 months back. That is not the job. But then now, if this check is now passed, right? What then do? We can now return false, right? Because it means that this user is still under our timeout. It means that this user is still temporarily blocked, right? So that is the first one with regards to can log in. So now when a user successfully logs in, what then do we do? So now come in here, say login schema.static, and then we say login success, and then this also will be asynchronous function which will take in a key, because we need to know who is this person that successfully logged in. So now get that login document, we say await, and then we say this dot find one, and then we find one by key, whereby it's that key, right? And then with that said, if this person or this document does exist, what then we do is we return and await, and then we remove that document. Because if a user is successfully logged in, we just want to remove that out, right? Because we, like I said, we're not keeping track of when this user logged in or when last this user logged in. We're keeping track of the attempts which this person is taking to log in, right? And then second lastly, what then do you want is we need to keep track of all the failed attempts, right? So we say static, and then we say login fail, right? So now with that said, this is also a synchronous function. We give that key, right? So now when the user failed to log in, what then do we want to do? First of all, we want to increment the attempt that this person is taking. So we want to increment those attempts by 1, and then we also want to update the timeout, right? And then once we do that, we also want to update this in progress to be false, because that means that the process of logging in is now stopped, because this person tried and then they stopped. That's, hopefully that makes sense, right? And then what then we do is we come in here, we say return await, and then we say this dot find one and update, right? So we find one and update. And then what then we do here is we want to query, right? We want to find this one by key, which is that key. And then what then do we want to update, right? So this is where now the whole magic happens. We now say inc. This is for increment. What then are we trying to increment? We're trying to increment failed underscore attempts by 1. right? And then the second thing that we want to add is we want to deal with the timeout. And then we'll say new date, right? And then secondly, what then we want to do is we want to update the in underscore progress to be false because the process is now stopped, right? So now this is what we do. But then secondly, we want to add options because say, for example, a user is trying to log in, you're a new person, we don't have your document in there, right? What then happens is if you do fail to log in, you realize that your document is not there. So this query might then not work. So, but then what then do you do with regards to that? We now give options to this thing. We can give say new is equals to true, and then we give an upset of true. What does that mean? This upset means that if this model does, or document does not exist, create that model, or not model, but then create that document. This is the most important thing, right? This upset that if, say, if you like, if I were to reiterate, I'm a new person. This system doesn't have my login detail attempts. I just created my account. So, but then I try and then I fail. So with that said, this thing will fail to handle this query because the document does not exist. So now what then does it do? It will have to create using this option called absurd. It will create, but then still have this thing with a failed attempt of 1. Right. That's very, very important. And then secondly, what then we want to do is we want to keep track of this attempts progress, right? So we're going to say static dot login in progress, right? And that is async function. Same thing, you guessed it right, give that a key, right? So now what then do we do to this thing? We still same standard procedures. We want to find this login. Do we need to find this login? Yeah, we can find this login. So find login as equal to await, and then we say this dot find one. We want to find one by key, and that is that key that we given, right? And then secondly, when this thing is in progress, we want to update, say find one and update, right? When this thing is fired, what then do we do? Right, we find one by key with that key given. That's the first thing. And then second thing, what then we do is we want to use the set, right? And then we want to set in underscore progress to true, right? And then the same thing applies, guys, that if this thing doesn't have my information, right, then it should be able to create this document for me to now make sure that this thing or my key has an in progress. So here, this is where we add our option, and then I can give it a new of true and then upset of true. This one is very important. This upset is very important to tell Mongoose that if this thing does not exist, give or create, not give, but then create this thing. So here we'll return this login document and the login dot underscore in progress. Right. So now this should be basically our functions or static methods that we're gonna be using. Right. So now to reiterate on them, right, we have this can log in. This can log in is for checking if this user is allowed to log in. How then do we check that? We check if this person has at least a minimum of 2 failed attempts. Less than 2 failed attempts, I mean. Because in our application, but in a real life project, maybe we can say maybe 5, I don't know. But then here for demo purposes, right? And then the next thing is if then this person has, because if this thing passes here, that means that this person has at least 2 failed attempts. So now what we want to do is we want to check the time difference, right? That did this person at least wait 2 minutes, a minute? In this case, we said this person can wait a minute, but then you could have added here 2 minutes just like that, right? Saying that this person must at least wait 2 minutes in order for them to retry to log in. But if then they've waited 2 minutes, what then do we do is we remove their current document and then return true. That means they can try and log in because we don't want to keep, we're not keeping track of when a user logged in, but then we are keeping track of the attempts at which they're taking to log in to avoid brute force attacks. But then if this then failed, that means that this person is under that 2 minutes. That still is waiting for that 2 minutes to finish. That's when we return a false. And then here, if a person logs in successfully, we get that document and then check if that document does exist. And if it does exist, we remove it. Right. And then second thing is because there, why are we then checking? Because remember, if I just created my account, right? And then I try to log in, because on can log in. This is the first one that we run here that can log in. And if then I log in and my document is not there because I just created my account, this application doesn't have my document. And then we first have to validate, because we don't just wanna remove something that does not exist. We'll be getting unnecessary errors. And then if a user then fails to log in, what then do we do? We increment their failed attempts, we update the timeout, and then we add the in progress to be false. Because now the progress of what this meant, the progress of logging in, or the process of logging in, has now been stopped. But then now we have to be careful that we have to add, this is the very most important one, the upset. We add that to be true, so that if this document does not exist, we create it. And then here is for updating in progress to set it to being true when a person is trying to log in. Right. So now with that said, we now need to use the static methods within our controller, so to be able to authenticate this user accordingly and to mitigate this potential brute force attacks that we can get. Right. So now what then do we do? Now we can come here to our auth controller. Right. And then when we come here to our auth controller, I can remove that. We have our sign in there. Right. So now with our sign in there, what then do we do is we need to create this key, right? And in this case, we'll use our email as key. Might not be the best one, because this thing can always be changed and everything, right? And manipulated. So but then for demo purposes, I'll use this key as my email, right? And then the first thing that I want to do is I want to check if a login process is already in progress, right? So this is where I can now come in here and say const is underscore login underscore already underscore in underscore progress, right? Some bunch of underscores, but then just to make it clear. And then here we add an await. And then with that said, that means that on the top level of this function, I add that async, right? So now what then do we do is we now await, we say, let's import that login model. So I can just copy this, paste that, change that to login tracker, change that to login tracker model, right? So now this is where now say await and say login tracker model dot, right? So now what then do I do? So here, how then do we call those functions? Is let's go to our login tracker. So you see here we've written names here. So this is the names that we call upon. So let's come here, we call this one, we copy that one, we say login in progress, exactly as we named it there. And then now we call in that function, we pass in the key, right? So let's console log this out so that you can see that it actually does work. And then do that. And then let's go to our Thunder client. First things first, did we expose this route? I think we did. Yeah, I think we did. So now let's go to our Thunder client. Let's test this thing out so that we can actually see if what we're doing is actually proper. So if I come in here, this thing is still restarting. Let's wait for that to restart. And we have that restarted. And then now that I can now send in the request, and then you can see it's null because there's nothing there. There's no progress that is happening, right? So now with that said, what then we do is we come in here and then we check, right? So we add our if statements to check if this thing is already in progress, right? So we say if is underscore, right? So that if it's true, then what then do I do? I return a response.status of 400.json, and then say to this thing, login already in progress, right? So now that is the first check that we make. So now if this check is now passed, we want to check if this person is not temporarily blocked, right? So now how then do we check this, right? We can also say const can underscore start underscore login underscore process, right? So I want to check if this person can actually start this login process, right? So that's where we now say await, and the same thing goes, guys. The same thing goes. We come here to our model, go to our model, not user, but in the login tracker. Here we go straight at the top. Which one handles login checking? Can log in. We copy that name directly, and then we say login tracker model dot, we paste that name, right? And then we pass in a key, right? So the same thing applies, that this thing will return back to us a boolean, either true or false, right? And then with that said, I come in here and say if not, because if not, and then what then do I do is we return a response dot status of 400.json, and then we can say to this thing temporarily blocked from logging in due to many failed attempts. Try again later, right? So now this is the message, because we know that if a person cannot start this login process, it still means that they are to still await their timeout to finish, right? So now if a user passes these two checks, it means this user we can now actually try and log in this person, right? So this is where now we first now get this user. We say const user is equals to await, and we say user model dot find one, and we want to find one by the email, whereby it's that email that they gave. And then first things first, we check if not user, because could happen that is not a valid user. Say send a response that status of 404.json, and then we say account with this email does not exist, right? And then the second thing that we do is, now if a user passes that check, it means that they have a valid account. So we need to validate their password, right? And this will now determine if this user did successfully log in or not. So this is where now I can come say const, and then is password is underscore password underscore valid, right? And I say await, because now we need to use our bcrypt, and we use that compare function. Remember that compare function that we added here? We use that compare function, and it's asynchronous. First argument that we pass is the password that you wanna compare, and then the second one is you wanna add the encrypted password, which is user dot password, right? So now this will return back to us a boolean, true or false. So now if not, say if not is password valid, and then we return a response, dot status of 400, and what then do? We say dot json, and then we say invalid credentials, right? But then before we return this response, we want to interact with this login tracker, and the method that we want to interact with is failed, because that means that this person failed. We want to log that into our system, and that's what we say await, and then we say login tracker model dot, and then login failed, we give in the key, right? And now that user should be now started to get tracked. Now that's where we now do that. But then now if this user then successfully passes this check, it means that the password is valid, and the user gave actually a valid password. That is where we now say await, and then we say login tracker model, because it might happen that this user failed once, but in the second time they do it correctly. So we don't want to keep that what is this, that document there. We want to remove it. So that's where we come and get this login success, right? And then we copy that, shouldn't be we do that, copy that, we pass in the key, right? And then that means that this user has successfully logged in. So now that function will handle exactly as I explained, and then for now we are not handling any sessions. That session part will be for next part. So now let's see if this thing works accordingly. So we come there, and then let's rerun that, and let's see if this user can be authenticated properly, right? So now I also have another Thunder client request opened. Here, first things first, we'll test out parallel request, because we don't expect this thing to work for parallel request. So parallel request is me sending two requests at the same time. That is what we call parallel requests, right? So I have that post, and I'll still give in the same body, because when we log in, we expect email and password, right? Still giving the valid things, but then we don't expect this second one shouldn't work, right? So now it's signed in. Let's first send in a valid one, and then it says login already in progress. What's happening with this thing? Okay, this thing is crazy now. Okay, let's see what's happening here. So our thing is breaking there by the this login in progress, right? So now why is this thing breaking there? Because this thing returns to me back a null object. So let's do that. Not this, but then let's say if this is equal to null, not equal to null, man. If this is not equal to null, and then that means that there is a login process already being made, right? If my conditionals are serving me properly. So let's see what's happening here, right? Let's wait for that to start, and then we can get it started. So I'll come in here, send that request, right? So it says login in process. Let's open our MongoDB. Let's see what's happening within our database, because this is weird, but then not to worry. So let's see. So to validate what's happening within our, but then first things first, let's see our in progress, right? So our in progress, we get that login document that's proper, and then we update that, and then we send that back. All right, and then let's see. Actually, let's log this thing out. Let's see what we're actually getting. Let's say console.log is login already in progress. Let's log that out. While logging that out, let's also be going to MongoDB, so to see what's happening within our database level. Let's rerun that, and then I would have been surprised writing that much code and everything working seamlessly. I would have been happy, but then surprised. So let's see what's happening, guys. Let's see what's happening. Sign in, and then is my server up? Yes. So let's send that request, and then let's see what we get. We get login in progress, and we got true. Interesting. Right. Interesting, because we don't have any, as far as I'm concerned, we haven't started any, unless I started unconsciously, which I never did. So let's see what we have, so we can make sure if everything is working well, because this is the first time we're testing the sign in. This is the first time we are actually testing the sign in, right? I believe so. Okay, let's see. No. Actually, we did when we pressed that now thing. I remember when we pressed that now thing, we actually did, and then I think that's where it was causing bugs. So let's go to our database, and let's remove all those documents that we have with regards to our login tracker. We come here to browse. We want to browse our collections. And then what then we do is we have our login tracker. And it is true, hey? So let's delete that. Login trackers. Right. So we delete that, and then we start off on a clean slate, because the time when we checked it out, it was not, but then it updated, right? And there was nothing that was, yeah, okay, so it makes sense. So now we have everything on a clean slate. So now we expect to send this request. We expect to get an authenticated person. Right now we're just sending one request. We expect to get this thing as true. Not true, but then login as true. Right? So now let's send that. We're not even trying a lot of things for now. We're just sending that back. And then that will take time. Remember how bcrypt, I think the heavy task that is happening here is by bcrypt level, whereby it's comparing the hash and the password that we gave. So that's where we have a heavy load of work there. Right. So now let's send that, and I believe I might get an error here, that invalid credentials, or we will get a 404 actually, because I doubt I have a user with that email. Let's see. Let's go to our users. Yeah. Okay. Actually, there is a user. The user's like this. Okay. So let's see. Let's wait for this thing to authenticate this person. As long as we're not getting any errors within our terminal, and then I should be partly happy. So let's wait for this thing. It is taking its sweet time, eh? This request. It's taking its sweet time. Let's see what's happening. Okay, this is weird. Why is it taking so much time, eh? Why is it taking so much time? Okay, let's cancel this request. Let's kill the server. Before I even run that, refresh this. And I shouldn't have anything within my login tracker. But then if I do, we'll delete each and every document that we have. So we delete all login trackers. Right. And then we go to our terminal and then run that application. Right. And then we come back here to our Thunder client. We send in that request. And then with that said, we should get something back right now with regards to that our controller is working just fine. Let's see. We should get that. So let's wait for this thing to process. Let's see what we get. As we get exactly that we are authenticated, right? And then now, with that said, let's try and authenticate this person while we try and authenticate this person twice. So here it's sort of like me trying to replicate a parallel request, right? So you can have a hacker trying to run thousands of requests at the same time simultaneously, and then that is something that we've mitigated here. So if I run that, come here, I run that, you can see login already in progress. No matter what I do, it won't allow any other request to go through, right? Because another process, which is this one, is already in progress. This is what we call parallel. We mitigated that part of parallel requests, right? So now the second thing here, say I give a wrong password, right? Remember the length. So this is another thing, right? Our checks, that it's checking the length of the password. If it's less than 10, we have those checks. So let's give it something like that. There's a wrong password, right? So this will pass our application level check. So we're having a good Node.js application here. So I gave it a minimum of at least less than 2 fails, right? So let's send in the first one, which should fail. Invalid credential. We send in the next one. We have that, right? And that is weird. Um, because there's no other one that is in progress. Okay, this is weird. So let's refresh that. Let's see what's happening here. All right, so we have some bit of bugs with regards to our code here. So let's come back and see. Right, so in progress, because remember, if it failed, it should reset this to false. So what are we not doing properly? So we go to our auth controller, right? And then here we gave it a login failed, right? And then the key. And let's go to our model. We came here, login failed. Let's make sure we call in the same exact one. That's true. And then we updated the failed attempt, and then we updated the in underscore progress to be false. And then we gave that upset of that. That's when we fail, right? And nothing is cascading. Okay, so now let's test this thing out. We now show that the parallel requests are now handled, but then now we are failing to temporarily block this user. That's a twist of the tongue, eh? So now we come back here. Let's send in that request. We should get an invalid um, request here. We should get invalid credentials. That's what we expect because of the password, right? So we send that, and then let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. So invalid requests. So not invalid, but then invalid credential. So let's refresh this. Let's see how our model is looking there, because now that model should have now been updated to an in progress of false, right? So let's go to our login trackers, and then we have an in progress of false, right? That is perfect. So now I come back here, and then we try and log in again. We have a login already in progress, right? So now why then do we have that login already in progress, right? Now let's refresh this. You'll see that, okay, everything is, we have this login credentials of false. If I'm not mistaken, this thing should still be false, right? As you can see, ooh, why is it changing to true? Why did it change that to true? Okay, let's see what we're doing wrong. So the first thing that runs is our login progress. That's what we call first, which will now check that. All right, so now let's come back here. Let's see. So the first thing we check is login already in progress, right? And what does this thing log out for me? It has been logging out false. Let's delete that. So what's happening with regards to our thing? Let's keep track of our login progress logs. So we come in here in our login process logs, login progress or process, login in process. Right. So let's keep track of this console log to see what's happening. Right. So now I've deleted everything, hopefully. Let's also delete this. Okay, there's no documents. Delete this document. Login trackers. Right. So now let's come in here. So this is just minor bugs that we have to fix. So there's no code that will work seamlessly same time. So here I want to keep track of this thing and see if our implementation is actually wrong on what level, right? So here we first check if is login already, it's if it's null or true, right? Because if it's true, if it's null or it's true, then that's when I can say login already in progress, right? So those are those things. If it's not null and if it's true, then I can say login already in progress, right? So let's send this request. Invalid credentials is what we expect, right? So let's sign in and let's see. So handling the parallel request was way much easier than handling this. So here, I guess we have some logic that we're not getting properly, and I'm pretty much sure you guys are seeing this. And it's unfortunate this is not a live video. It would have been easy for you guys to now come through and help. So the first one is now, right? Obviously, because this person has nothing yet. So if I refresh that, we should see within our document false, because we now had a login of failed. Now that should have updated to false instead of null. Right, now if I come back here, we can see we get false and a failed attempt of 1. That is perfect. So let's try and fail again. So we try and fail again. Let's see what we get within our logs here, which is very important. So we see if we try and do this again, what are we actually getting within our logs? Let's also have this thing side by side. Hopefully it'll be visible. So we have that login process of false. We have a login process of false, right? And here the response that I got is login is already in progress. All right. And then here, what then did we check? We said is login already in progress is equals to true, right? But then here we're getting false, right? Because it's not in progress. So, but then why did it hit this? Interesting. If its login is not now, right? Say that, because that is a boolean. If it's null, then it won't hit that, from my understanding. Let's check this document. Let's check this document up. Let's see what are we, and why this, when I failed, why is this failing too? Okay, so now the next thing that I want to check before we even continue with this part here, I want to check here, why is this failed attempt is possibly invalid? Why is this failed attempt, is this thing getting executed? Console.log updating failed attempt. Right, I can say that, updating failed attempt, just like that. And then we delete this thing one more time so we can see what's actually happening here. What are we doing that is not proper? Very, very weird. Very, very weird. Okay. So let's see. And also with regards to, we get the login, the timeout, we get date, time difference. Everything looks fine by me, to be honest. When we fail, we update the in progress to be false. And we have incremented the failed and the new time. Absurd, obviously. And then now in progress, we set that to that. Okay, let's see. Right. So now we come back here. We log that. We should get invalid credentials. Login process of now. And then we should get update, the update console log that we had written, which is this one. We should get updating failed attempt. There we go. We get that updating failed attempt. Right, executed. And then invalid credentials. And then I come back here to my login trackers. I should get a false of in progress. Right. So now that is working well. Let's clean that up. And then let's keep track of the new ones that we get now. Right? So let's wait for Mongodb Connection to see what's happening. So we come back here. We send in a new request. Let's see what we get. We get in a login of false. Right? And then did we get a response? We didn't get a response as yet. Right? That's perfect. And then we should get an updating we should get an updating failed attempt, right? So let's keep track of everything. Hence I always clean this terminal. So obviously the big crypt is taking its sweet time. It's taking its sweet time. So let's see. Here we expect the updating failed attempt to log out. If we get that, then I'm somewhat pretty much sure that we are on the right track, I guess. And we haven't got any response yet, right? So let's see. I don't know why there's BQ, or maybe it's just my computer that takes its sweet time. I know, because I believe if I had a way much more greater computer, and then This bcrypt should have worked seamlessly. Right. So let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. So we're not getting any errors. We're not getting any feedback. What's happening here? What's happening here? Let's wait for this thing, guys. Let's wait for this thing. I'm sorry for the delay, but then in order for us to see what's happening, we just have to wait for this thing. Right. So we have that processing. And then I don't know if I come back here, I refresh that. Okay, that will still be true. That's fine because we're still trying to log in this person. But then now we should get, then we get updating failed attempt, and then we get that invalid credentials, guys. Right. So now that is working just fine. We get that updating failed attempt, and then now we come back here. I expect this thing to be false without any compromisation. I expect this thing to be false. So if I come back here, we expect that to be false. There we go. Everything is working fine. And then our failed attempts, it's 2. Right? So now let's come back here. Right. Let's come back here. Let's clean this up so that we can see anything that happens, anything funny that happens. So hence I always clean this up so that we can see. Right. So now we come back here. Now we should be blocked. So if I send this request, we should get temporarily blocked from logging in due to many failed attempts. There we go, guys. So now we have this user being blocked and this user cannot log in due to that. Right. So now with that said, guys, so this is how then we handle all these things with regards to handling a user's login while making sure that we avoid this brute force attacks that we can potentially have. Right. So now with that said, guys, I will end this first part of the video here. We had some bit of hiccups at the end when it came to handling this static methods, but there we now see that everything is working. Some bit of console logging helped us, but then I don't see actually, because if you think about it properly, what did I update here? My code was just being funny for no good reason. So with that said, guys, I'll end it here. Please like, share, subscribe. Next session, which is the next part, we'll be looking into session management because now we can authenticate a user, but then now we need to handle those sessions, guys. So please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.